Welcome guys, new video. I make this video immediately after the last video, the scam video. I just thought, I might as well just make another video. This video fortunately has nothing to do with getting scammed. This video is about a very interesting realization that I had frequently with buying and selling Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Because what I have noticed, like in the last year buying Yu-Gi-Oh cards, and it's like a good example because I have like a couple of vintage cards here. Yu-Gi-Oh, especially Yu-Gi-Oh vintage cards, have this very weird dynamic where it's like they are in this weird situation where it's really difficult to find these cards and it's really difficult to buy them. But at the same time, if you try to sell them, it's also very difficult, right? And it's this like it's a weird concept, right? Like it doesn't really make sense. Because if something is really hard to be found, it should be expensive and easy to sell, right? But so why are Yu-Gi-Oh, like vintage Yu-Gi-Oh collections or vintage Yu-Gi-Oh cards? Why are they so hard to find and still difficult to sell? Or at least difficult to sell at like a decent price, right? And I think I kind of like figured out why. And that's what I want to talk about today. And because it this is something that really I thought a lot about, because for me as a collector, I'm always trying to find old Yu-Gi-Oh collection. I'm always trying to find old cards. And like, you can trust me, it is really difficult to find old school Yu-Gi-Oh cards. It's not difficult to find Yu-Gi-Oh cards, right? Like there's no problem in finding cards. And there's also, I guess, no problem in finding old cards. But there is it's really difficult to find like cool old school cards. So like the cards like right here that I hold into the camera, like these are not crazy expensive cards or anything, but these are like very cool vintage cards in pretty decent condition. And this stuff is hard to find. It really is hard to find. And me, after buying so many collections and being so much in the hobby, I know it is difficult. I know it is hard to find these types of cards and to find collections that have these cards in them, right? But at the same time, like when you try to sell these cards, they don't sell, or it's really difficult to sell them. And I even know from a lot of people that like try to sell their entire collections, like they have to take really large discounts or like many game stores don't even buy them anymore. Like, for example, when I buy collections, I'm buying collections at like 70% of the value. And that used to be normal a couple years ago. Like a couple years ago, I would assume most game stores bought Yu-Gi-Oh collections, like good expensive cards, at like 70%, 60% of the value. But nowadays, from what I know and the game stores that I know, most of them quit completely. They quit completely buying Yu-Gi-Oh. They don't buy at all, at any rate. Like you could offer them your collection at 30-40%, they don't buy it because they just don't carry Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, because of course unfortunately they all switched to Pokemon and One Piece because there's just more money in it. The cards sell faster, the cards are more valuable, and if you just would try to make a lot of money, you probably just stay away from Yu-Gi-Oh, right? And so, of course, there's some people left buying, but it's like it's much less people than what it used to be 3-4 years ago, right? When most game stores bought Yu-Gi-Oh. And so it's this weird situation where it's like the cards are rare, it's difficult to find them, but you're gonna have problems selling them. Like if you try to sell them at like a good price, they will not sell, or they will sell very slow. I speak from experience. And if you try to get rid of them fast, you have to sell them at large discounts, right? And so like what makes that happen? Like why is this? Because you could like you could give a simple explanation and just be like, yeah, Yu-Gi-Oh is just, nobody cares about it, nobody wants it, nobody collects Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, and all the stuff is not rare, and that's why it's all cheap, and that's why you just can't sell it properly, right? But that can't be true, because if the stuff would be so common and it's so easy to get these cards, then why do I have such a hard time looking for it? Why do I have such a hard time finding collections, right? So it can't be true. And so, silly enough, the conclusion that I really came to is that it sounds wrong, but it's true. It's really difficult to find Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Like good cards, once again, like bulk, garbage, yeah, there's infinite of it out there, like that's not difficult. But to get like high-end good modern stuff, or to get like nice vintage cards in good conditions, is actually, it's difficult to find, you know? And it's not even the price. It's not even that it's like necessarily super expensive, but it's just, there is just not that much out. It's not that easy. It's really difficult to find a good Yu-Gi-Oh collection, even good modern collection, and especially vintage collections in like really good conditions. Like there's probably way more vintage collections than there are modern collections, because back in the day much more people collected. But the problem is that most of those collections are complete garbage and the conditions are complete garbage. And so it is really hard to find good collections. And still, if you try to sell the cards as singles or whatever, it's still difficult to sell them. And the reason why, in my opinion, is just that we just barely have new people in the hobby. I think that we just don't have a lot of demand anymore. So the cards have some scarcity. Like modern high rare cards are rare. And vintage cards in good condition are rare. And they are not easy to find. But the problem is you just don't have many buyers. You just, you know, there's just not enough people willing to buy this stuff. And then you could be like, well, yeah, I guess, you know, nobody's collecting Yu-Gi-Oh anymore, and that's why you have no buyers left. But I also think that's not true. I think the problem that we have is a very similar problem that Magic the Gathering Vintage has. And that problem is that the people that really care about the cards and that really value the more rare, more expensive, older, good condition, whatever, hard to pull cards, they probably already own the cards, right? It's not that they don't care about these cards, but the cards are just somewhat expensive. Some of them are very expensive. And the cards that really care, the collectors that really care about these cards, they already own them. It's 2026. Yu-Gi-Oh came out in 1998. There was a huge hype 5-6 years ago, you know, with the entire Pokemon hype in 2020, 2021. The guys that really wanted to collect Yu-Gi-Oh cards, they probably already did it. They probably already have their collections. Like at some point, you know, it's like at some point people are done. And most collectors, they care about the old school stuff, right? So they don't care about the modern stuff. They want the old school cards, and eventually they are just done, right? And like how many cards do you really need? So at some point, you know, you're just done. You're done collecting. You have the cards you really care about. Maybe you have 2 free copies, but eventually you're done. You don't need copy number 4 or 5 or whatever. And for example, I myself, I start to feel that same fatigue. I already own most cards that I really care about. And eventually, what happens when you own the cards you really care about is that you probably stop collecting, or at least you slow down. So like, of course, you know, if you have like a €100 card and I want it and I can get it at like a large discount, I'm still buying it. But I'm not buying it at a premium, and I'm also not buying it at market anymore because I don't need it anymore. I already have it for my collection. And I think that's where probably a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh collectors are. They already are many years in the hobby. They probably already collected most stuff that they really care about. And now, either they get a really good deal or they just don't buy because they are fatigued. They don't really need any more cards. They have enough, right? And I mean, yes, there's always going to be one guy that's like new in the hobby, and he just starts collecting and he's like still missing all of those old cards. Like there's always going to be some people, but I feel like because Yu-Gi-Oh is just not as exciting right now as Magic or especially as One Piece and Pokemon is, we probably just don't have a lot of new people in the hobby. And if you just don't have a lot of new people in the hobby, you're just lacking demand, right? And so it doesn't matter if your cards are very rare and old and very hard to get, what a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh cards certainly are. If there is no people that really want the cards and still miss them in their collection, you're gonna have a hard time selling that, right? And I feel like that's probably the explanation. At least that's what I came up with. That's probably the reason why you have this weird situation in the Yu-Gi-Oh market where it's really difficult to find good collections. It's really difficult to get good cards, but at the same time, when you own this good stuff and you try to sell it, you're also going to have issues, right? And it doesn't make sense, but when you're thinking about like that, it maybe does make sense. And for example, like with Magic the Gathering, I've heard many people in Magic that are like very frustrated that vintage Magic doesn't go up in price anymore. So like I'm not a Magic expert, but like Magic cards went up a lot in price in like also 2020, 2021, the entire pandemic hype and all of that stuff. And like in that time period, Magic, especially vintage Magic and reserve list Magic cards, like they went up a lot in price, right? And eventually they kind of like came down, probably crashed in price, pretty similar to what a lot of the Yu-Gi-Oh cards did. And since then, so like basically for 5 years, vintage Magic cards, even the reserved list cards, and with the reserved list cards, for the guys that don't know, Wizard of the Coast, the owner of Magic, they are not allowed to reprint these cards. They themselves introduced the reserve list to protect and stabilize the secondary market like probably 20 years ago or something. I think it was in the early 2000s. And they themselves announced that they will never reprint cards on the reserve list. So you have some really cool, really old Magic cards that are officially not allowed to be reprinted. And for the last 5 years, they did not go up in price, right? And I think it's probably very similar with what we experience with the old Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Is that, yes, the stuff is really cool. Yes, it's very old and very rare. But you're just lacking demand. Because this stuff is so far in the past that the guys that like really cared about it, they probably already bought. Like, like Magic the Gathering, like that's like another 10 years behind Yu-Gi-Oh! Like if you wanted a Black Lotus, if you wanted some reserve list cards, I guess there's some people in the year 2026 picking up these cards. But there were people 5 years ago, 10 years, 15, 20, 25 years ago. I think Rudy from Alpha Investments, he talked about how he bought like PSA 10, Black Lotus, Mox Pearl, like all these Power 9, like the most valuable Magic cards. Like he bought his graded copies like in early 2000. So like people are in this market for like over 20 years. So the guys that really wanted their copies, that really wanted their cards, they're probably done. And that's why you don't have a lot of demand. And of course, what most certainly will also hurt the demand is of course the prices. And vintage Magic, I think, especially the reserve list stuff, is like much more expensive than Yu-Gi-Oh is. So like with Yu-Gi-Oh is like a lot of the cards that we have are like quite cheap when you think how cool and how old they are. But with Yu-Gi-Oh, of course, they just constantly reprint the cards. So like we could, for example, let's take something like a Metal Raiders Unlimited Summon Skull or whatever, right? Like that's probably, I don't know the exact price, but it's probably like an unlimited light plate, maybe near mint. It's probably like a 50 euro card, right? And like a Metal Raider Summon Skull in like near mint, the old print, like that is pretty cool, right? Like that is a pretty rare, pretty cool card, and that like really, you know, it really would deserve like a higher price. Like if that would be like a 200 euro card, 100 euro card or whatever instead of a 50 euro card, it would be reasonable, right? But it isn't. Why isn't it? Because the card has 5,000 reprints, right? I think they gave him a QCR. I think he has a Platinum Secret Rare. He has a Speed Duel Secret Rare. He has tons of common and rare cards. He has alternative artworks. Like, it's just the thing with Yu-Gi-Oh! Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards just need to be cheap because they need to compete with constant reprints. And the reprints are just very cheap and affordable. And so Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards just have a very hard time. They just have a very hard time to become very expensive because they just constantly have to compete with cheaper reprints, right? And that's like just, that makes it difficult. So in Yu-Gi-Oh! Maybe the price isn't quite as much of a problem. There's actually a Summon Skull, just talked about him. So it's just a common version. So with Yu-Gi-Oh! Maybe the problem isn't that the Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are so expensive, but the problem is that there are so many reprints, and the reprints are even cheaper. And with the Magic reserve list stuff, it's like, yes, they don't get reprinted, but of course these old Magic cards are already like very expensive, right? So it's like two different things. Yu-Gi-Oh! Isn't expensive, but it gets reprinted all the time. Reserve list Magic doesn't get reprinted, but it's already very expensive. So it's like both sides have like their issues. But at the end, I think the problem that both categories have is the same. The problem is just you are just lacking demand. There is just not enough demand because I think we just don't have enough new people. There are not enough people that care about vintage Yu-Gi-Oh! Or care about Yu-Gi-Oh! Because, you know, in Yu-Gi-Oh! We just have a lot of problems. And with Magic, there's probably enough demand for modern Magic, but that doesn't mean that there is demand for vintage Magic, right? And some of that has probably to do with the fact that just the guys that really wanted to buy this stuff probably already bought it, right? They probably already bought their stuff and they are just done collecting. And so I like, that's what I came up with, and I think that's the explanation, or kind of like the explanations that I came up with why Yu-Gi-Oh! Feels so weird. Because for me, it really feels weird. Because every time I try to sell something, it's really difficult, it sells slow, it sells at bad prices. If you throw stuff at auction, it sells at discount, and so on. So it's just frustrating and kind of like demotivating to sell stuff. And that's also why there are so many cards right now that there is no way on earth I am selling them. I just keep all the nice stuff in my collection because I to some degree I just feel like it's undervalued, and it would just hurt me. It would just feel bad to sell a lot of the cards that I care about. So like all of those cards I just showed you in this video, they all stay in my private collection. I'm not selling them. Why am I not selling them? Because they are so cheap, I rather just keep the cards, right? And so it's this weird situation where it's really hard to sell Yu-Gi-Oh! But when you try to buy the stuff, it's also so difficult. It's so hard to find good cards. It's so hard to find vintage cards. It's so hard to find them in good condition. And most of the stuff out there is just complete garbage and junk. You know, and despite it being so difficult to find this stuff, it's still difficult to sell it. And that's just a weird dynamic. And that's just kind of like what I think, you know, that's kind of like what I think is the reason behind it. That like the stuff is quite rare. The stuff is not that easy to find, but we're just lacking demand, right? And that just creates this weird market. And I think, you know, with the Magic vintage market, for example, I think it's something very similar. So yeah, and we also have a highlight card today, and this is a pretty nice one. I have a Obelisk the Tormentor, and this is a very special card because it's the King's Court Millennium Rare. And I actually, you know, I just talked about it, that it, you know, really sucks to sell cards. I got this card really cheap on auction. I think I got this card for like €5, and it's not a €5 card. The last time I checked, it was like a €20 card. I don't know how much it is right now. Maybe it went down a little bit, it went up a little bit, but I got it for like, I think for like €5, maybe €7 with shipping, like something like that. But like at like, I don't know, 30% of its real value. And even at €20, like this is a very rare card, and the price is like very reasonable. Unfortunately, it has a print line, so that's really disappointing. But yeah, so really a cool card. Also, unfortunately, you can barely see the effect, because how they designed the Obelisk card is that like only the background is holographic. And of course, with these King's Court Millennium Rares, they have these hieroglyphics in the background, but it's just so difficult to show it on this card. And I think that's also why I probably got it so cheap on auction, is because people just didn't notice that it was the Millennium version and not just the normal ultra rare. You really can't see it in the artwork, like very slightly here in the background. The best way you can see it is actually in the stars. Yeah, but that's like a card I picked up like probably first half 2025, maybe even in 2024. And yeah, that will conclude it. And let me know in the comments if you guys also have like a really hard time buying and selling Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's just so weird, because that shouldn't be a thing. Like, if stuff is easy to buy, it shouldn't be easy, you know, it shouldn't be difficult to sell. If stuff isn't easy to buy, it shouldn't be so bad to sell, right? But that's the weird situation that we're in Yu-Gi-Oh! In the year 2026. So, thanks for watching.